Welcome, everyone, to our second and final plenary session for this first day on states in emergency. And I'm sitting right here with Christine Chinkin, who, of course, needs no introduction, but I was told I can't get away with the same quote twice, so I actually have to give an introduction this time. Christine, if I may, start with the post-nominals, because I love them. FBA, CMG, Fellow of the British Academy, and Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, or otherwise known as Call Me God. We do, of course, have KCMGs in here. Where's Sir Michael? Kindly call him God. Of course, Christine Chinkin is Professor Emerita at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's the Executive Chair of the International Law Association, and she's been a member of both the UNMIC Human Rights Advisory Panel with respect to Kosovo and what UNMIC is doing, or was doing and still doing in Kosovo, and the UN fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict. And of course, she's written very widely, and she is an intellectual heroine of many in here. So we're going to have a conversation. And so we really did try to organize this and to script it. And every time we sat down to sort of try and script it, it completely fell through because we were going off all sorts of tangents all the time. So after many hours, we decided that, it's a conversation. It's going to be free-flowing and anarchic a little bit. It fits with both of us, and it befits sort of like the last session of the day just before drinks. So bear with us. The best sort of thing that we could come up with in terms of structure is the following 3 points. That we're going to try to talk about how do crises and emergencies impact different people in different ways, why that is so, and what can be done about it. So that's sort of like the rough structure that we'll try to follow. But first things first, I always get lost with terms unless I have some sort of definition or definitional elements. So to kick this off, Christine, what are we to understand as a crisis, and what is an emergency, right? What are some definitional elements there?
Okay, well, thanks, Antonios. And as you said, we have tried very hard to put some sort of structure around this, and there's just so many different elements to keep thinking about. And even today, I think what I would have said was a crisis or an emergency before the beginning of the day, I have now started rethinking. And I was very struck by Elizabeth Wilmhurst in the previous session, who said, of course, there are multiple crises and multiple emergencies. And, I mean, we can just think of sort of across, I don't know if it's a spectrum or continuum or just different places on it. Conflict. And, of course, we're all thinking Ukraine, Russia constantly. But let's also think about Ethiopia, Tigray. Think about what's still happening in South Sudan. Then think about the way in which conflict itself creates further crises or perpetuates further crises. Conflict is a vector of disease. So what we have when we have conflict are outbreaks. Yemen, for example, has had major outbreaks of cholera, of COVID-19, obviously, other diseases within that. We're also seeing, of course, Somalia, those of you who've looked at the paper today, where the combination of conflict, of climate change, of disease is leading to the major crisis around food insecurity, starvation by any other name. So if we try to sort of think about, well, what is a crisis or emergency, I think we also have to think perhaps along time and space in different ways. And it seems to me, and from what I've already just said, many crises and emergencies are layered with one thing on top of another, on top of another. And within that, we have been talking, I think, a lot throughout the day of crisis emergency from the perspective of states. Well, I think it was Sam Wordsworth said in the last session, something about the multiple injuries suffered by the DRC in the case that was brought, DRC, Uganda. And not everybody within the DRC experienced the various crisis emergency in the same way. Different people within any crisis situation, depending upon their previous situation, which I think we'll come back to in just a moment, will experience that crisis and emergency in multiple different ways. So we have to sort of think about the layers of different people and how they are affected by emergency and crisis. And then I think as well, there is the crisis that nobody recognizes, the ongoing crisis that becomes normalized. So that, for example, violence against women. 2 women a week are killed in this country. What's called femicide is a global phenomenon. I'd call that a crisis, but it's an ongoing crisis that doesn't tend to get recognized, doesn't tend to hit the headlines in the same sort of way. So, yes, and out of all of that, how are we defining crisis, Antonio?
So I get the temporal layer and the spatial layer. And I understand sort of like the compounding of crisis one on top of the other, because you can say that in particular in crisis situations probably sort of femicides become more common than they would normally be. But the question that I have, and it's pretty naive and a little bit provocative, is, I mean, come on, a missile hits everyone the same way, right? It's not like going to stop at me and say, oh, LGBTQI+, well then I'm going to hit you instead of, or this. A tsunami hits everyone the same way. COVID, well, hits everyone roughly the same way, or somebody might say that. So why are we trying to sort of like draw distinctions here? What's the reason?
Well, I think there's 2 questions in that. One is why are we trying to do it? But I think maybe first think about, well, how can I sit here and say different people are affected by a crisis in a different way? Now, I mean, first of all, of course, a missile may be targeted. If a missile is targeted at a maternity hospital, then it is clearly hitting a certain group of people. When we were doing the Gaza report, one of the issues was a shelling incident that hit a police training academy. That is a gendered targeting, targeting at men. And I mean, crisis or emergency per se are not discriminatory unless they are targeted in that particular way. What is discriminatory is the impact and the consequences. And quite clearly, the impact and consequences, the way in which people experience a particular crisis, depends upon multiple factors. I'll talk about gender first, but I'll also talk about some of other factors. If we think gender, you just mentioned the tsunami. Figures across the Indian Ocean tsunami of, 2003, 2002, showed that the figures of Aceh, this is in particular, that the mortality rate was 3 to 1 women in the ascendancy. In India, Sri Lanka, over 70% of the victims of the tsunami were women. And, you know, as you said, the tsunami comes ashore and doesn't discriminate. So why are the figures disproportionate? Every crisis, every emergency has its own context, but there are some generalizations. One generalization is rooted in the behaviors that are expected and are being performed within particular societies that are gender-based. So, for example, with the tsunami, women were wearing the sorts of clothes that you can't turn and run very easily, or had children that they were carrying, that they were looking after, went back to look after elderly relatives. Numerous sort of ways in which behaviors were such that impacted upon the ability to respond to the particular crisis. You've just implied this, and I think it is worth repeating, that crisis and emergency leads inexorably, I would say, to an increase in gender-based violence, and particular gender-based violence against women. So we have to ask why. Why is that so? It came to the sort of headlines during the COVID crisis, but it gets repeated in numerous other sort of aspects of crisis. Inequalities. Inequalities lead to the way in which a crisis is experienced. Inequalities and power. So that if certain groups, and I'll use women just for a moment, have less power in society before the crisis hits, that's going to have consequences at the time of the crisis. If women have less access to resources, less access to land, less access to vital public services. If we think about emergency and crisis, the classic situation, of course, is a collapse of or a less efficient functioning of public services. Okay, let's give a couple of concrete examples. Ukraine. We are obviously reading a great deal about the impact of the aggression invasion in Ukraine. A report has just come out from UN Women and Care International that is looking at the gendered impact of the conflict in Ukraine. We know, obviously, that military conscription is gendered. Men are being required to stay back and fight. So the great bulk of the refugee population are women. And displacement in any form, again, back to the layers, displacement creates inequalities, vulnerabilities. And in the context of, say, refugee camps, displacement camps, any area of instability, there's likely to be food insecurity. Accessing food tends to fall on women, and women are, in any case, as I said, the bulk of the refugees. Food insecurity, poverty, impunity around gender-based violence, all of these multiply upon each other. They create a situation of likely exploitation, vulnerability to trafficking at the borders, for example. You might remember that Ukraine was already, prior to the conflict, a major country of origin for trafficking across Europe. So if that situation is already there, it's going to get multiplied. I've said I'm not going to talk just about women. Those who do not conform to a gender binary are very frequently targeted. A crisis situation will accentuate that targeting. Again, coming back to Ukraine, there's been situations where trans people have not been allowed to cross a border because they are told that they are not, in fact, women, that they are still men. Syria, there has been a lot of evidence with respect to targeting of LGBT people. Escape routes to get to other places get closed in a time of crisis and emergency. People who are perhaps not widely accepted within their own community first, which is often the case with LGBTQI people, may lose that domestic support. And so, again, becomes subject to higher levels. Just to give one other example of, again, not gender, Antonios mentioned that I was involved in a human rights panel in Kosovo for many years. Now, I think if people think about crisis in Kosovo, they're likely to think of the 1999 bombing and then think that the crisis probably came to an end. We were into a post-conflict, post-crisis situation when UNMIK comes in and acts as the territorial administration in Kosovo. And one of the cases that we had before us on the Human Rights Panel involved the Roma population in Kosovo. Now, as we all know, the Roma as a minority are targeted in a situation of suffering discrimination, powerlessness across Europe generally. Certainly that was the case in Kosovo. Following the adoption of 1244 Security Council resolution, following UNMIK coming into Kosovo, the Roma settlement within Kosovo was attacked and was burned and was destroyed. The Roma they were a situation of powerlessness. They were perceived as being on the wrong side of the conflict. UNMIK has to relocate them. What did UNMIK do? They relocated them on an area which was lead contaminated. And what we then had to deal with was the consequences of this lead contamination. This is an ongoing crisis. I mean, it clearly was not the end of the crisis as the rest of the Kosovo situation. It was also gendered. Lead contamination clearly has issues for women who are pregnant, for looking after young children. Within the particular cultural aspect of the Roma people, having children is an important part of the continuity of their own identity. Multiple layers come in there. So, I mean, the two big words, inequality, powerlessness, and I would throw in patriarchy.
And so you should. But the question is, okay, so here's the question then from this. Why are we, as in, or at least why are we blind to these layers? Why are we, okay, of course, yes, we're international lawyers and, you know, the state is a unitary entity and we don't pry too far because then we get all confused. Fair enough. But that doesn't mean that we can't actually properly appreciate the things that you said, which are fairly obvious, i.e. that crises can be layered, they are particularly gendered, they exacerbate one another, and they expand sort of horizontally in the sense of sort of like, I don't know, femicides becoming far more common during a period of economic crisis or during a period of military conscription or what have you. So the question is, why is it so? Why is it so difficult to sort of go deeper into this and not just see everything in terms of Ukraine versus Russia or tsunami hits Japan or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I really know the answer, but some sort of speculative answers. One is just research, statistics, data, etc. And very frequently, the moment of emergency crisis is not the moment to actually gather those sorts of data. Who defines the crisis? Who decides that we have a crisis actually in place? By and large, it is the elites of any particular country. They are likely to be male elites. The levels of women participation in governments worldwide is still very low. And so determining that there is a crisis that needs a response, it's not a priority. I think that is often the case as well, that to see what's happening to the country as a whole, rather than trying to dig down and say, well, you know, here's a group that are being affected in a particular way, not in another way, is not necessarily going to be a priority. I think at the moment as well, we also have to be very aware that there is a very pernicious, what I would call gender ideology, which all of this currently is playing out against. So what we are seeing at the moment is very clearly a backlash against human rights in general, a backlash in particular against women's human rights worldwide. I mean, one could say the warning signs, one looks for warning signs as to what's likely to happen in a crisis. Russia, prior, sort of going quite a long way back, was a very strong advocate of a gender ideology that rejected any notion of giving particular credence to violations of women's human rights. Okay, as a concrete example again, I was involved in a negotiation for a recommendation of the Council of Europe on combating sexism. It was a follow-up to the Istanbul Convention, which is a treaty relating to gender-based violence. The recommendation was basically saying what is part of the root causes of gender-based violence. One of them is acceptance of sexism, sexist behaviors, and so on. In the negotiations, the Russian delegate constantly rejected any notion at all of the concept of gender, the concept of gender stereotypes, the concept of gendered behaviors. And this was very clearly part of the cultural background. There was also legislation in Russia, probably pre-COVID now, which essentially attempted to decriminalize domestic violence. It was obviously more complex than that. But again, you had this whole gender, and I'm giving Russia as the example, because again, I think back to the layers ideas, we can see how it plays out in what's going on now. But the abuse of gender as a way of justifying particular policies that go towards denying, in particular, women's reproductive rights is very pervasive. It's much more. And I think that all helps explain why there is an unwillingness to recognize the way in which social structures, social ideologies all contribute.
And that's very interesting. We've had other problems with the Istanbul Convention, but I was about to take you there and say, how does all this connect with international law? What are the connecting points with international laws? One point is the Istanbul Convention. There are other treaties that are relevant, but let's say, what are the warning signs, and what are the avenues for redress to some extent within international law, or at least what are the connections with international law? And we'll take it from there.
Well, I think there's been quite a lot of discussion throughout the day generally of human rights. And human rights, obviously, are one of the entry points. I would just make the point that CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, with, and I've suddenly gone blank, 189 states parties, doesn't have a derogation clause for emergencies, so that it continues to apply throughout any emergency or any crisis. The CEDAW committee, in fact, has issued an extremely good general recommendation number 37, which is on the application of the convention in the context of climate change and other natural disasters, which emphasizes the importance of all policy making being compliant with the convention. Istanbul Convention, for those in Europe, which I think is a response to what I called the ongoing crisis relating to gender-based violence and sexual violence, in particular against women. Again, I don't know how much people know about that, but again, as part of the gender ideology, what we have seen recently is Turkey withdraw from that convention.
I didn't want to say it.
Sorry?
I didn't want to say it, because they'll say I'm Greek. And
I think it was 2021. Last year, it sometime withdrew, which again then relieves I would say Turkey is, of course, still a party to CEDAW and is still a party to the European Convention on Human Rights, both of which have state positive obligations with respect to the exercise of due diligence for prevention and prosecution of violence against women. But what Istanbul has is a great deal more detail. And I think it comes back to your previous question as well. I said that, who defines a crisis? Who responds to a crisis is also important. And if the agents of the state, the police forces, the law enforcement forces, etc., do not acknowledge that there is an emergency, then nothing is done. And one of the things the Istanbul Convention does is put very strong legal obligation on states to respond to situations where there is likely to be gender-based violence.
And I mean, yes, and that's difficult though, because you might have the obligations to respond to gender-based violence, but all too often you hear, for example, reports of people trying to report domestic incidents or hearing hearing sounds of violence and calling the police, and the police either not responding or showing up, sirens blaring, by which time,
right.
Unless you're an idiot, you will stop doing what you're doing and keep silent, and so on and so forth. So in a way, on to the next question, which is, okay, so there is a legal framework which we can use to address like the multi-layered crisis of groups that are not constantly in the public eye as opposed to states. So the legal framework is there. But that's not enough to deal with it. So quoting Lenin, as one must, at least once in any public international law conference, I suppose, what is to be done with that legal framework?
Can I just go back first? Just to go back to the legal framework. I just think...
You're avoiding Lenin.
Lenin was not a great feminist.
So I hear.
Okay, but just to go back to the legal framework first, and then the bigger question, what is to be done? I mean, it is important, isn't it, to identify these different issues as incurring legal obligation, identifying them in law and therefore having the corollary of legal obligation. I mean, again, just to go back to the issues relating to sex discrimination, gender-based violence, until sexual harassment was recognized as a legal wrong, there was no way of attacking it within law. So I think it is important to have the legal framework there. Secondly, I think what's happened in international law recently, now particularly with respect to gender-based violence, it is too often conflated with the particular form of crisis of conflict. And so what we have is a very big focus on sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, without thinking about, well, why does it occur in conflict? One of the reasons being the inequalities and everything. We thought about it. Coupled with recognizing sexual gender-based violence and conflict is an assumption of shifting responsibility to individual criminal responsibility, particularly in the international criminal. And then, of course, turning to the situation of international criminal law is still, in terms of implementation, very weak. There are very few. What we still have to, I think, emphasize is the importance of state obligations, state responsibility, positive obligations. And I think, again, this was being said in the previous session, even where they are not complied with, even where we have to recognize the weakness, we have to have those obligations there in the first place.
So I'm really glad you say this, and I'm really glad you say this, not because I'm not all for individual criminal responsibility, but I do agree with you that sometimes we seem to sort of like only be focusing on this and, who we can put in chains and throw in prison. And because you obviously can't do that to that state, we forget about state responsibility. But then sort of like the counter argument to this is, oh, come on, state responsibility, so what are you going to do? You're going to expel their ambassador as a measure of retortion and perhaps close down your airspace to them, which might hurt you more than them. That's one point. Then you can say that's a general point about international law, and we can discuss it. But the second point here is, I don't see any states rushing to sort of like expel diplomats of states that have a well-known record of very, very horrific discrimination against women, or who treat LGBTQI people in a particular way, even criminalizing their behavior, or who completely discriminate against Roma people, for example, or anything like that. So you don't see many states, I mean, obviously you have something like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yes, it's huge, and everybody sort of like immediately goes to sanctions and so on and so forth. You don't see many sanctions against states who sort of like prohibit women to drive or something like that. Well, I haven't seen that.
So, as you said, this is part of the weakness of international law in general. And, I mean, let's face it, it's even worse, isn't it? Not only do we not sanction, we go on providing arms to states that do that, and we go on increasing the militarism and the power structures that continue all of that. This is not just an issue around emergency and crisis, is it? It's an issue around how do we uphold a rule of law and a serious commitment to state obligations across the board. And I'll throw it back at you. How would you do it?
I agree with what you're saying, but I think the main problem is that we think that somehow this is a problem of the law rather than there's a problem of the fact that no one's interested in sanctioning the states that we sell weapons to, because I mean, who wants to lose that business, and it's okay if women can't drive? Which it isn't, but this is not a problem of the law. It's not that the law doesn't give you the tools. Okay, the tools may have problems, right? But then again, which legal tools do not have problems? It's just that there is a lack of interest in pursuing this at the usually male elite level.
There's a lack of interest, and I think you've also touched on another problem, which is that the conflicting interests that are at stake with this. So that, for example, we see completely separately the whole current economic system, for example, and don't look at the way in which the international economic system feeds into the various issues that create crisis and emergency. Again, in a fairly obvious example, we have a peace process which is supposedly bringing an end to a particular form of crisis, for example, at the end of a conflict. At a peace process, the international economic structures are put to one side and are dealt with in a completely different framework, and fail to take into account how international economic aspects may, in fact, feed into furthering forms of crisis. So, for example, if part of the economic post-conflict situation is austerity, cut back on public expenditure, etc., what does that do? It cuts back on all of the areas that we've already been talking about, which continue the crisis for further sections of the population. So we have that whole framework. Then a lot of crisis is dealt with as humanitarian aspects, and the humanitarian aspect, come in. Then we have the security people. Then we have the, so there's a whole number of different silos in international law. And I'd be very interested to hear what our colleague from the United Nations has to say about this. But very often, I think the United Nations itself is seriously disadvantaged in being able to look at a crisis holistically because of these multiple institutional and substantive and procedural different areas. And I don't think it's just an issue of special regimes of international law. I think it actually goes beyond that into a sort of siloing of international law. But if one started from the other end and said, well, what is the harm and how is this crisis affecting different parts of the population, then these silos don't matter. Then we would try and resolve, wouldn't we? Well,
at least you would try to coordinate more.
Yeah, at the very least,
if you had that.
So I have a coherent, holistic type approach.
So you're almost sort of answering the last question that I had in this connection. Of course, Christine's happy to take questions afterwards, which was sort of more than the general what is to be done. It's the more specific what can allies do to sort of help in this connection. I don't mean this in, oh, I'm male and almost white, so not all men and all that stuff. I mean true allies who think that there must be some way to assist in the process of either desalloing and better coordination, to the process of getting states more interested in seeing the different layers when trying to address crises at the international level. Is there anything that sort of allied international lawyers can do in that sense?
Resist. Resistance is always one answer. I mean, if we just think about the ways that have been suggested of trying to address issues of inequalities and prevention and so on. Remember, crisis creates opportunity. Okay, we always tend to think of it as being the negative, but crisis can often open up spaces. Think about, again, think of the Secretary General when the COVID crisis first came out, talking about a global ceasefire. I mean, that was quite an innovative and imaginative idea to come up with. That probably would not have come up without, a crisis to do it. So stop thinking about women in particular, but other groups as victims only. Think of the knowledge, resources, experience, skills, etc., that are also gained during a crisis, and look to use those in any policy and legislative and social reconstruction that may be going on. Participation, try to get away from the idea of we're up here, we'll go in there and save them down there. That the people who are there are those who are actually working, surviving, very frequently being highly innovative and highly entrepreneurial in surviving. Use those skills and those resources that they are generating. And women are often at the forefront of that. Again, particularly if we're talking, say, conflict-type crisis, if men are away fighting, who's keeping the community going? And so on. So use what is available. You just said we have the tools. Don't we too often in international law think in a too limited way about what tools we have?
I think you're absolutely right, and I also, in a way, it's something super optimistic that just came to me. It's the first time that I ever hear anyone, and this is unscripted. We hadn't talked about this. It's the first time. So there is this saying which it goes around a lot, which is a crisis is an opportunity. So every time I hear that, then that the hair on the back of my neck, I don't have any on my head, but the ones on the back of my head, they stand up, because that basically means, oops, you have an economic and financial crisis, we're going to privatize everything. That's usually what it means to turn a crisis into an opportunity. But it's the first time that somebody uses it, giving it that positive spin, which leads to the next point. And the next point is, crises open up all sorts of opportunities. The question is, who's going to go and claim the opportunities? And in a way, that is a very optimistic message to allies, which is, look at the possibilities that a crisis, the spaces that a crisis opens up, and then it's up to us to go and claim the particular spaces before, they're claimed by other people for other purposes, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so at least, okay. That sounds good. I like that. So, I mean, we can continue discussing this, but we can open this up for further discussion with the audience. Now, there are different ways in which you can participate. One is there are roving mics, so you have to stand up in front of everyone, say who you are and where you come from, and throw a question to Christine.
Or to you.
Or to this me,
is a conversation.
But I'll be at the drink. And the other one is you can do it online, and they're supposed to be fed to me. This is why I have my phone here, not because I'm checking Facebook or anything. Roving mics are around, and I see a hand over there, the gentleman over there. Yes, thank you.
Where? I can't see.
Hello. Conway Blake, Deborah was in Plimpton. When I heard the conference title, my mind went directly to an article by your co-author, now Judge of the ICJ, Hilary Charlesworth, International Law as a Discipline of Crisis, which was a very illuminating for me as an undergraduate. And I wondered if any of the insights that Hilary brought to us through that body of work can inform the discussion that you're having. The resonance is about you saying crises give rise to opportunities for lawmaking. A lot of the international law that we have now arose out of the World War II, climate crisis. I wonder if that way of framing the debate and way of thinking can contribute anything to what you're discussing right now.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great article. And I think that the important message, this is the article, if people didn't get it, by Hilary Charlesworth, as International Law as a Discipline of Crisis. And what she's saying in it, essentially, is that over and over again, what we end up doing is rewriting international law in the wake of a crisis and then using that as sort of the norm until we come to the next one. And part of her argument is surely what we should be doing is, in fact, looking at everyday, an international law of the everyday, so that we have the tools, if you like, sort of being crafted through the everyday that are then available and ready. And I think that's very much, just sort of two things to add on to that. I think that is what, again, there's been quite a strong emphasis on trying to think of using international law as prevention, and prevention of crisis. And that would surely require going back and looking at and rejecting the power structures that are leading us constantly into these forms of crisis, whether they are the economic power structures or inequalities and so on at home. So the need to see the continuum, and crisis is here, but to try and think prevention first. But also, shouldn't we be allying international law more with things like the Sustainable Development Goals? And the Sustainable Development Goals are essentially an aspiration, a code, precisely to try to avoid having people within states in the situation of poverty, inequality, lacking education, lacking food security, etc. And the point with the Sustainable Development Goals, and Hillary wrote that article certainly well before the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think she would have, shouldn't speak for somebody else, but I think would probably see the linkages, that they are grounded in international law. That was the big difference with the Millennium Development Goals. And so to try to think about, well, how do we use international law? Isn't it significant that over and over again, when we've been talking about human rights today, we've been talking about civil and political rights? What about economic and social rights? And how economic and social rights are a counter-answer to what you just said about privatization.
They're too expensive, Christine. They're too expensive.
But only to look at the military, but the military budget worldwide during COVID went to its highest ever level. I've got the figures somewhere. And that's when we have a major crisis around where we need, around health, where we need economic and social rights. So why do we turn to military expenditure, for heaven's sake? It's really going to kill the virus, isn't it?
Or police, for that matter.
Sorry?
Or police. That's definitely not going to kill the
or
virus,
prisons, etc. Sorry.
No, but I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I'm scanning for hands, because we can take that further. Oh, there's another one right there. And in the meantime, I can ask, isn't all law a discipline of crisis? But
all law,
and
a discipline of power.
Right, well, exactly. Yes, thank you.
Hello, my name is Keith Ebel. I'm a British Army lawyer. Professor Chinkin, I think education is one of the greatest enablers for change. Do you have any practical steps and recommendations for state bodies to actually effect change through better public understanding of international law?
Sorry, a better understanding of international law itself?
During times of crisis.
Or at all times, surely. I mean, wouldn't to include international law as part of a regular curriculum? Is that what you're getting at? Or, I mean...
So I mean, at the moment in the public domain, we hear about war crimes. We hear about the impact of sanctions. We hear about various issues.
Right.
It's about enabling the widespread understanding rather than... This is a very specific body of people who are very interested in international law. To actually get real change, you've got to educate, I think, the wider population in a very clear way so they have a really good understanding. I think that enables change. I just wonder what your thoughts on practical stuff.
I think I agree with you, totally. But I mean, I would go further on education generally. Education is so important, isn't it, in terms of shifting mindsets, shifting cultures, providing a body of a starting point, to enable people to understand, the role of human rights, the role of international law, and I mean, again, coming back to the sort of particular gendered aspect, the importance of ensuring equality of access to education and equality of access to appropriate. Now, of course, one runs straight away into cultural aspects when we start talking about appropriate education, but using at least the framework of human rights, the framework of international legal ordering as an educational tool. Yeah, absolutely. Could we get it into civic education in this country? I wonder. And again, the question comes, why not? What is the resistance to including international law? It's not even a compulsory subject in most university law schools. Yeah, that surely would be a starting point. Is it compulsory at Oxford?
No.
No, it's not at the LSE. Yeah.
It's not. It's a third-year elective.
Yeah, absolutely. And by and large, the students that take it are already those who are committed to it.
Probably so.
There's a problem of teaching it to those who are converted.
I was getting slightly worried because I was getting only boys sort of to lift their hands, but the internet came to the rescue. And so Georgiana and Susan have sent in questions, apparently. Can you do both if we do them in? So Georgiana says, how do you comment on the engagement, or rather non-engagement, of the Draft Convention on Crimes Against Humanity with gender-based crimes, in particular gender apartheid?
Yep.
And Susan sort of comes back to the question of what is to be done, and she says, I agree that the international machinery, especially at the multilateral level, lends itself to a siloed approach, especially as all international organizations are nervous about stepping outside their mandate. Can states and international lawyers work within this system to reduce the limitation of the silos? The limitations of the silos, so sort of coordination. And then Thekli, third question.
Can we stop there?
Let's stop there.
Take the first one. Gender and crimes against humanity draft convention. I don't know how much people know about this, but the first draft of the Crimes Against Humanity Convention included the definition of gender that was taken directly from the Rome Statute, which of course was drafted back in 1998. And there was a huge outcry among feminist international lawyers and others, and considerable work was done, including then getting like-minded states to also weigh in against using that definition, to get the definition of gender itself changed within the draft statute. But I think your question goes much beyond that, which is still the idea that within the crimes against humanity, there are certain crimes that are gendered crimes, rather than seeing gender as an issue that goes right the way through the whole concept of crimes against humanity and international criminal law. So, for example, issues of land command responsibility have big gendered implications, so that the overall framing of the convention should have been, I think, through a gender lens. I don't know whether Sir Michael Wood is still in the room or not, but I would say that this is a losing battle with the International Law Commission. The International Law Commission, on its latest draft on jus cogens, peremptory norms of international law, has dismissed the idea that gender-based discrimination should be regarded as jus cogens, and has refused. So it seems to me that it's just rejecting more generally. I would add that I think gender-based persecution as a crime against humanity would be an extremely good peg upon which to try and really push the whole notion of gender through international law more fully. Siloing, surely we're back to the point that was made over there. Education is one very good way of doing it, the way we teach international law. I mean, I think at the moment we tend to teach international law still in set topics, and perhaps don't do enough of weaving the different layers in at different stages. Maybe your course is completely different.
I mean, there is also material that you have to cover. There is something to be said about trying to weave in sort of other considerations, so that students can understand both the potential but also the limitations of the law. I think sometimes we don't put enough weight on both the potential and the limitations. We tend to treat it as if it's, well, I mean, to come back to what Lady Arden was saying this morning, a panacea, but nothing is. Unless you know the limits, you can't use the tool properly.
But I'd also take it a stage or a slightly different angle as well. The question related to institutions, and that's what I was talking about. I think civil society has the same issue. That very often civil society organizations see themselves as a humanitarian organization or a human rights organization, and so on.
So it's self-imposed, you're saying?
Well, no, funders imposed.
And
I think the whole issue about where funders will give for projects and so on as well would be another way of trying to break down the silos. But also to come back to education, do you teach weapons law?
I do.
You do, okay. So many of these areas of international law don't get taught. And again, to see the linkages between, say, weapons law, international economic law, human rights law, environmental law, how the whole ways in which they are brought together. Maybe what we're talking about are postgraduate seminar courses.
When it comes to weaponry, only in postgraduate.
Where we can actually do it.
I suppose this is really interesting, and you could take it further because you could say, the United Nations, for example, does not have a mandate problem in that sense. So it is self-imposed, it's self-siloed. Because, a large organization has to find a particular way to operate as well, so it's not an easy answer.
And, of course, the issue of expertise.
Well, that's
where particular experts, what was the third?
The third one is, are the actors of international law equipped to address the multiple layers of crisis and promote equality? And there my question would be, actors?
Who are the actors?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
We have, and shall we take a couple more
more
in terms of actors? We have one back there, yes?
Good afternoon, thank you. Not a lawyer. My name's Simon Smith. I'm from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the International Justice and War Crimes team. And I just wanted to back up what the colleague said over there in terms of education. And I think it's not necessarily about getting to the education at necessarily degree level, postgraduate level, and so on, but at least the basics being taught in schools. And one of the ways that can be done, of course, is through the national curriculum in schools. I know I'm singing the praises of the UK government, but we produced a report on domestic implementation of international humanitarian law. You can get a copy up from the Red Cross stand. They work very closely with the British Red Cross here. You can get a copy of that, and the idea being that you can compare our commitments under international law to our domestic law, and therefore being able to actually prosecute domestically and not have to rely on international tribunals or courts. But one of the other projects that we're also doing is working with third countries to actually encourage them to produce their own domestic reports, and also to get that into a lower level of education. When I say lower level, I mean to the secondary level of education as well, so that people do grow up understanding what their rights are and also what their obligations are under either IHL or humanitarian law. And I'm a great believer in prevention being better than cure. And of course, we've seen the atrocities in Ukraine, allegedly committed by Russian forces. And the other one, of course, is educating the armed forces of the country, and also the civil defence forces as well, in international humanitarian law and on their rights and obligations. And I think that, to a certain extent, will stop many of the atrocities that we now see today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So, thank you for those comments. And I think particularly the issue not just of educating armed forces in international humanitarian law, but educate a broader holistic that includes human rights and includes issues around gender and other identities and stereotyping, and so, a broader than just the IHL framework.
Thank you.
Alice, is it okay if it's the last question? Because I think then people are going to get very angry if they don't get their drinks on time. Go on. Thank you.
I just wondered if you could say something about the situation in Iran and whether the fact that international attention is focused on the terrible situation in Ukraine means that the rebellion in Iran might actually take hold. Thank you.
I'd slightly shift that as well, but in the way that the attention to Ukraine has diverted attention away from Afghanistan. The big crisis last August, in particular, again, affecting women, with the withdrawal of troops and the coming to power of Taliban. And that has just gone right off the radar. And I'd agree with you totally that, that's been reasonable coverage, but just what women are facing in Iran at the moment and the extraordinary levels of protest that are coming from women and the extraordinary level of courage and raw courage that they are showing to respond to that crisis. You said, what can allies do? Again, support, resist, say that we've heard and that we've seen it, and so on. But isn't this the problem with the world's media generally? That, there's one crisis at a time? I mentioned Tigray earlier. How much does that get covered, at any particular time?
There are even follow-ups online. Christine, do you remember the time when we were like, wow, a whole hour? Are we sure?
Can we think of anything to say?
We have unfortunately reached the stage where this needs to end. But of course, we're here. Christine's going to be here. You can come to her with questions and more discussion. And of course, this is the end of our first day. So after thanking Christine from the bottom of our hearts for this plenary session,